As someone who sews historical and vintage clothing as a hobby and really enjoys the transformative aspect of the research, the patterning, working with true vintage supplies and techniques, I often run into the problem where once I'm through with the fun of making a garment, I don't actually wear it. That's all well and good, but for the amount of time and money that I put into sewing as a hobby, I'd like to actually have a wardrobe that I love to wear. So in order to begin incorporating silhouettes that are more modern, more versatile into my wardrobe, I figured a great first project would be an oversized jacket that I know I can just throw over anything and I'll get a lot of wear out of. Now, like many of you probably did, when I heard that Joann's was closing, of course I had to go over there and see what fabric and patterns I could get for a good deal, so this project was kind of born out of that. Under normal circumstances, I usually don't buy sewing patterns. I think it's cheaper and more fun to draft them myself, but in light of the sales at Joann's, I decided to pick up a commercial sewing pattern. I think this is only my second commercial sewing pattern that isn't vintage, and that is S8843 from Simplicity. I really liked how the jacket was a bit oversized, had like big patch pockets, and it also had a hood, and I figured I could try and make it in a style similar to these jackets that I saw on Pinterest. The fabric that I'm using is this green cotton twill. I would have preferred like a tan or a brown, but they unfortunately didn't have that in stock, and I also bought this brown polyester lining fabric to line the jacket. So here I'm pinning the tissue pattern pieces onto the fabric. Most of the time, if I work with a pattern at all, I work with true vintage patterns that have either been cut out already by their previous owner or were sold already cut into whatever size the pattern was for. So it was a little bit different for me cutting the pattern tissue into one of the sizes on the package. The cutting layouts and the number of pattern pieces that you needed were a little bit different for me because I wanted to line the jacket, and the jacket from the pattern was unlined. And so I had to mess around a little bit with the pieces that they wanted as facings and the number of pieces that they wanted cut out of different fabrics, just to make that all work out. So the first thing I did was the pockets, which was actually the most complicated thing on this jacket. You would think it would be pretty simple because they're just like patch pockets, but I kind of overcomplicated them because I wanted them to be lined as well, and the pattern didn't have a lining, so I kind of had to figure it out as I went. So the first thing I did was take the lining fabric and make a pocket bag for each of the pockets, and I also French seamed that so that there wouldn't be any raw edges on the inside of the pocket. Looking back, I think I could have made it work without the French seams, but I figured it was a good idea just to make sure I didn't mess up. Next, I worked on the top edge of the outside fabric of the pocket, and so I basically pressed in all of the edges like you would normally do with a patch pocket, and also pressed down the top edge so that I could turn that inside out and have it finish nicely along the top. I had to get a bit creative for the lining of the pocket. I don't know quite how to explain this, but basically, since we have patch pockets, the front part of the pocket is made up of the actual pocket itself, and the back half of the pocket is just the front panel of the jacket. But using the lining fabric, we have to line both the front of the pocket and the back of the pocket, which is the jacket. So the lining of the front edge of the pocket only has to come up to the edge of the pocket, but the lining of the back has to extend up into the pocket flap. If I was being really smart, I would have cut the lining of the pocket flap one with the lining of the pocket itself, but I didn't think of that, so I just left an allowance of fabric as an overlap. So right now I'm shortening the side of the pocket lining that will face the pocket itself, as I explained, and also clipping the seam allowances so that things would lay a bit smoother. Then I laid the pocket bag inside the outer patch pocket, making sure the pocket lining lay within the seam allowances of the actual pocket so that they'd be enclosed when I sewed the pocket on. Then I could tuck that outer edge of the pocket lining into the top edge of the pocket and pin that, and then could finally stitch the patch pocket onto the front of the jacket. These patch pockets were so much more complicated than they had to be because of the lining situation, but I do really like the pop of color that you get when you open up the pocket and see the lining. Next, I worked on the pocket flaps, the outer side of that being the jacket fabric and the inside being the contrast lining. And I just top stitched around that edge to make it match the bottom of the pocket. Then I could stitch that straight onto the jacket. As you can see, I've got the overlap of the lining to make it all seamless. And I also stitched along the top edge of the pocket flap to hold it down. And then that extra allowance from the bottom of the pocket, I just trimmed that and folded it over to cover the raw edge from the top of the pocket flap that we just attached. Honestly, I'm glad that these pockets were at the beginning of the project, because if they were at the end, I really don't think I would have had the patience to get through all of the thought that it required to figure out what order in which to sew everything so that everything would be neat and hidden. Next step was easy, just stitching up the shoulder seams of the jacket. Next, I worked on the hood. This is actually the first time I've sewn a hood, so it was interesting to see how it kind of all came together. Ideally, I wanted a hood that was like kind of oversized and came down pretty far on my back when the hood wasn't up, but since this was my first hood, I didn't really know enough about the patterning to know if I should alter the hood that came with this pattern, so I kind of just made it how it was and hoped for the best, but I'm actually really happy with the overall shape of it. This hood has like a centerpiece down the middle. I know some of them are just 2 pieces and they come to kind of like a point, but this one was a little bit different. Then I pinned that to the upper edge of the jacket and clipped a few points on the seam allowance so that it would sit a little bit flatter when I went around to sew it. I also didn't bother with any of the interfacing stuff that the pattern suggested doing because the fabric that I chose was already so stiff. I figured it just wasn't worth it. After sewing on the hood, I set the sleeves. As you might have noticed, I haven't sewn the side seams yet, and that's purposeful. In a lot of jacket and other sort of workwear patterns, they sometimes ask you to set the sleeve flat, so you just kind of insert it into the armhole seam without having sewn the side seam, and I think that's so much easier than the traditional method of setting the sleeve into the armhole. And then after you set the sleeve in that manner, you're able to just sew the sleeve seam and the side seam just straight down the jacket in one straight shot, which is really convenient. The body of the jacket was pretty much done at this point, so all that was left to do was the finishings like the front edge and the zipper and stuff like that. So in order to do that, I sewed the lining exactly how I sewed the rest of the jacket, just in the brown polyester fabric that I bought. At this point, I realized that I'd accidentally bought a non-separating zipper when I was at Joann's, so I had to take a break for a week in order to order a new separating zipper and resume work on the jacket. At this point, I kind of just stopped following the directions and just completed the jacket based on what I thought it needed, mostly because the fact that I was lining the jacket made it so much different. So first, I basted both edges of the zipper to the front of the jacket, using my zipper foot, of course, to get pretty close to the zipper teeth. Then, after I basted on the zipper, I layered a facing cut out of the outer jacket fabric and stitched it all down the front edge. What you're seeing now, I initially messed up the order of things and had to resew it with the layers in the correct order, so what you're seeing now is not quite correct. And the convenient thing about the lining was, since the hood was lined, I could just sew around the entire jacket from the bottom of one of the front edges, up the jacket, around the hood, and then back down, just finishing that edge all in one piece using the lining. After I sewed that front edge, I could turn the jacket right side around so that the lining is on the inside, and then it was just a few finishing things left to do. So first I ran a line of stitching around the hood seam to secure the lining to the jacket at that point. I could have also secured the lining to the jacket at other points like the underarm and the side seams, but it was laying pretty okay, so I figured it wasn't really worth it for me to do that. And I also ran top stitching down the front edge along the zipper, and I continued that line of top stitching along the edge of the hood just to keep that edge nice and crisp so that I don't have to continually press the jacket later on. I really love how the contrast lining looks, especially on the inside of the hood, because you can see it poking out the edges of the jacket. I think the two fabrics match really well, and it kind of gives the illusion of like one of those jackets with a corduroy collar of a contrasting fabric, which is a style that I was debating going for, but obviously chose the hood in the end, so it kind of gives the same effect with the contrast fabric as that other style. The last thing to do was all of the hems on the jacket. I turned the jacket inside out and kind of let it hang naturally on my dress form, and then pinned the lining right above the cuff of the sleeve so that the lining would be secured in its natural position, and then I trimmed that down a bit and turned up the bottom edge of the sleeve to finish both those edges. I ended up finishing the cuffs of the jacket by machine, but for the rest of the handwork that had to be done, which was the lower edge of the jacket and securing down that front edge facing, I just used a really small whip stitch. Usually I use a cat stitch. It's a stitch that's pretty common on vintage clothing and tailoring to secure down things like this, and it's a really pretty stitch, but it does catch pretty easily, and I wanted to make a really practical jacket, so I figured I'll just have to go with the boring whip stitch. The jacket pattern includes a few pieces that I decided not to include on my jacket. One of them is a placket that goes down the front of the jacket, and they wanted you to put snaps on there. I didn't have the hardware to do it, and I was originally planning on doing buttons, but then I thought about it for a minute, and I realized that the buttons would have to go on the jacket itself, and the button holes would go on the placket, and I thought that would look a bit strange, so I decided to just completely leave off the placket. There was also a casing for a drawstring to go around the waist, but at this point I tried on the jacket, and I decided that I really liked the boxy, oversized fit, and I thought having something at the waist would disrupt the line of the jacket, so I decided not to add any of that stuff. In the future, I might add buttonholes and big tortoiseshell buttons to the pockets and the pocket flaps, but I also might keep it plain because if there's no buttons on the front of the coat for the placket, it might look a bit like mismatched. So this is how the jacket came out. I'm actually really happy with it. The only tiny thing that I don't really love is that the hood has small tucks around the collarbone area, and that causes the lining to kind of puff out there. I don't love that, but there's not much I could have done about that, so I don't really mind it. Other than that, I love how oversized this jacket is, how I could just put it over anything, so it's going to be a really versatile piece. I feel like a lot of the time when I make vintage silhouettes, those pieces don't really go with as many things in my wardrobe because mixing eras doesn't really feel quite right, and lots of vintage styles are very high-waisted, so it's not quite as easy to throw a vintage coat over like a modern sweatshirt. But I don't think I'll have that problem with this jacket, so I'm really glad I chose to make it. As part of sewing a more versatile wardrobe, I have a lot of fun projects planned for this summer, so if you don't want to miss that, feel free to subscribe. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.